Today, I want to talk about Dolby Atmos, that new fancy surround mixing format that everybody's talking about and that you and me probably haven't fully understood yet. I want to find out what it is, how it works, and what it can do for you and me as rock and metal producers and mixers. Because it is not just a multi-channel stereo, it's a totally different concept, a totally different idea altogether. You don't even have a mix bus in Atmos. And you can have 15 speakers, but it's also supposed to work on your stereo headphones, which I haven't fully understood yet. So there's a lot to unpack, and especially because big companies like Apple are pushing this format so heavily, it might just be the next big thing. Time to get prepared. Here we go. As you can see, I'm not in my studio today. I have come all the way to the UK, to the Audient studios here, to meet my good old friend Adam Steele, who happens to be an Atmos expert. As you might know, he's working for Audient now. Audient are really pushing the Atmos thing as well. They're really interested in this, and they have released the very first monitor controller and audio interface intended for immersive mixing.
That's right.
So we're going to talk about that, and he's going to answer all my stupid questions, and he's going to enlighten us. Great to be here.
Always great to see you.
This is a wonderful place. We are surrounded by, how many, 15 or something?
Yeah, so this is our headquarters. We built an Atmos room specifically to show off Oria and be able to use it. It's 9.1.6, so yeah, 15 speakers and a big sub. You don't need that many, but you can go up to that number with what we have.
Let's just start here. 9.1.6. That means 9 speakers.
Around you, yeah. One sub, and then 6 above.
And that is maybe the first thing that that people need to understand, that unlike stereo or unlike, let's say, 5.1 or something, the Atmos monitoring setup can be very different, right? It can be anything from headphones up to a setup like this, and anything in between?
In between and even beyond.
Because usually you do, like, if you mix a record and you mix it in stereo, you just mix into 2 channels.
Yeah.
You know, you render or export those 2 channels, and then people can play it back on a stereo setup. In Atmos, from what I've understood, is that the actual mapping happens not during the mixing process, but actually during the playback.
That's right.
Some kind of decoding.
That's right.
And that's why we don't have a mix file, but we have some kind of multi-channel file.
Yeah, it can be a little complicated, but what we used to have to do, especially in old surround sound, 5.1, the way that you would work with 5.1 is you had 5 channels and a sub channel. And when you give them to someone to make a DVD or whatever, they have 5 channels, 1 sub.
5 speakers plus 1 sub, and that's, you play just like in stereo with more channels.
That's right, and that's how that works. But Atmos, it's more like kind of a cloud of sound. And so when that gets exported, it kind of gets frozen in time as this cloud of sound. And then when you play it back, that talks to whatever device you have, whether it's just an iPhone or a big hi-fi rig or a cinema, and says, what do you have?
How many speakers do you have?
And where are they?
And where are they? Okay.
Because that's very important. And so it works out from that. Because traditional surround sound, computer processing was very limited then. Now computer processing on a small chip, you can do all this crazy maths and it just works. So you'd say if it was a small home theater, you might have 5.1.2. That's what I have at home. I have a center speaker, 2 at the front, the usual, 2 at the back, and 2 at the top. And it sounds really good. My front room is not very big. And so we get the full kind of effect.
It basically means you can use your stereo headphones, but the more speakers you have, the more detailed or precise the imaging is going to be, right?
That's right. Because if you have more speakers, then it can put things in more precise places. As the room gets bigger, you find the speakers are further apart. So there's kind of a hole in the sound.
Okay, right.
So if there are more speakers there, it can actually project from there.
But that means when we're mixing, I mentioned that in the beginning, we don't have a master bus anymore because we don't know how many channels we're going to have. It depends on every single playback system.
Yeah.
So instead of creating, 15 different masters, we just create some kind of open format which contains all the let's call it multi-tracks more or less.
Yeah.
And the information about where they should be in the mix or where they should move in the mix, right?
That's
and
right.
then some kind of decoder is going to interpret that
Yes.
and make the best out of it depending on your playback system.
Yes. So when you're finished with the Atmos, you can export in a few different ways, but generally there's a file that goes off to Apple iTunes or goes off to a filmmaker if it's sound for a film, and they can interpret that how they want. And so then there are options like there's the binaural is the really crazy one, which is the headphones.
Yeah, I haven't understood that yet. How can surround work on stereo headphones?
So that is to do with just crazy maths. So yes, you only have 2 channels, but if you have headphones on, and we know roughly how big the human head is and how the ears work, so they can do things like if there's a very slight delay on a sound, and also they remove some of the top end, that can feel like it's coming from behind you.
Okay.
Or if something, there's a little bit of an extra reverb added, but something comes exactly out of both left and right, it can feel like it's right there.
So there's some active processing happening,
Yes.
trying to compensate for the lack of speakers.
That's right.
Okay, so delays, filters, even reverb.
Yes, but very, very, very short reverb usually, just kind of it puts
Yeah.
it in a small space.
And where is that happening? If I listen on Apple Music, for example.
So if you listen on Apple Music, that specifically is happening with their processor out on your iPhone or Mac, or they've decided that's how they want to do that. Which means if you've got different types of their AirPods, they have different processing in them, and the newer AirPods have better processing as they improve.
Can I use any headphones, or do I need Atmos compatible headphones?
2 answers. So if it's Apple specific with Apple Music, you can use any headphones and you get the binaural, which is that's what I would call the good version. And then there's the Apple specific, which is the great version.
Okay.
Because they're all the way to the end, they're doing all
They're talking to each other, and it's like one system. Okay.
Yes, whereas binaural is really cool. That's a fixed thing. That can be rendered down to just left and right.
Okay.
Which is what we've been doing in the videos demonstrating Oria, because we can just add that to something like a YouTube video.
Yeah.
So then you can put your headphones on and it's
Kind of.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I tend to find as well that the difference between listening as someone who's just listening and mixing is quite different.
Yeah, that's right.
But that's the same as listening with a phone in your hand or, through a TV compared to being in a treated mixed room.
Sure.
Same thing, where yes, you can hear it, being able to make critical decisions is quite difficult, which is where you come into a studio like this, because critical decisions, you want it to be right when you give it to people, and that's where the crazy speakers come from.
I think, because I could see Atmos becoming really big, but I believe it all depends on the playback to make it as easy as possible for everybody, so you can just use any headphones.
Yes.
Yeah. And it still translates. So that's going to be, and that's the main difference maybe compared to 5.1 or other surround formats, and the reason why they never made it outside of the home cinema world, because nobody's going to buy 15 speakers.
Yeah.
Yeah, right? So,
absolutely.
So if we reach a point where it sounds great on my Odyssey headphones or any other headphones you might like, that might be, I think, the game-changing moment, right?
Absolutely. And there's so much now. It's all the technology is left in the hands of the endpoint for listening.
Yeah.
As that technology gets better, the Atmos file can be the same, but their experience gets better every year.
Right. As long as you've mixed it properly and put it into that file.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the same as within stereo. If you did a really good mix in the 70s and you play it back on a super modern system, it sounds better than it did then.
Exactly, yeah.
Because it was done right.
Exactly.
Very same kind of thing. We've seen now with the latest iPhones, as an example, you play back just through the speakers. If you hold it in the right place, with an Atmos file, it feels like it's kind of around your head.
Wow.
Because their processing makes that happen.
Wow.
It's always better to have the bigger systems, and but depending on what you have, where you are, it just works.
Okay, let's talk about the creative side, the mixing
Yes.
side. So what you say is the minimum speaker setup that you need to do proper Atmos mixing?
Well, this is very user dependent. For me, the minimum would be 5.1.2, because you need something to be above you.
Yeah.
And
So that means center, and then
Left
two
and right.
speakers here, two speakers there,
Yep.
two speakers above you, right,
Yeah.
right, like in the middle.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
But the generally accepted, I think at the moment, kind of what should is 7.1.4 because there's 2 at your sides, 2 right behind you, and for the height you've got in front of you and behind you.
Yeah.
So then you're in a big cloud of sound.
And how do I set them up? Are there like strict rules how to do that, or?
There are. Dolby have some very specific things that they want you to do, especially if you want to be a Dolby certified studio.
Sure.
But we appreciate that not everybody has a perfect room. Not everybody has the space to do things perfectly. So as long as you can get everything, in my personal opinion, as close as you can, then you should be okay.
But there is some kind of paper telling me if you have so and so many speakers, this is how you should set them up.
Yes, well there are standards like SMPTE standards, the motion picture experts, where your center is in the middle, then your left and right is the same as a stereo. The next 2 are just behind you, and the next 2 are way at the back.
Okay.
And then the ones at the front, there is a certain angle they really should be at.
I just imagine this to be an acoustic nightmare in many rooms, isn't it?
Oh yes, yes it is. Even a lot of big studios we found around the world that were treated perfectly for stereo were treated that way because the 2 speakers were in one place.
Yeah.
And so maybe some of the treatment at the back wasn't taking that into account.
Because you didn't have to,
Yeah, so now as they're putting speakers into these places where maybe there are some modes or reflections that was never an issue before.
No.
It's interesting.
But you're offering at least some help for this, right? With the Oria, because
yes, very much so. That's a big part of Oria. It's not just here are 16 outputs. On board, there's all the calibration. So there's EQ for every channel. So if you've got something like a bass problem or a mid problem or something, you can dial that in. It's also got the time delays. So if a couple of speakers are not in the perfect place.
Yeah, sure. Okay, they're being corrected.
Yeah, they're being corrected so that all the sound hits the listener at the same time.
Yeah.
There are like level adjustments and everything because say a couple of speakers have to come a little closer. They're going to feel louder. So you take them down by the correct amount. All that kind of stuff.
Here, this really makes sense. I mean, it has an inbuilt SonarWorks, right? The Oria, which is doing all those kinds of corrections, not only frequency correction, but like you mentioned, delays and level corrections.
So the way I would describe it is that we have partnered with SonarWorks to integrate their way of working into Oria. So we work with them. Every box comes with a SonarWorks microphone. You don't have to use it. You can manually adjust everything with the EQs if you have...
You don't want to do that.
Yeah.
To be honest.
If you have a degree in acoustics or you have an acoustician and you want to do all that, you absolutely can. But otherwise, you spend an hour measuring the room in the multi-channel SonarWorks mode, and then you send that measurement straight to Oria, and it loads it in the hardware, and it's done.
And what's fantastic about it is that it runs on DSP, so that means you have close to no latency.
Very, very, very close.
Right, and you can even have like different profiles for different speakers, for different, like, so really flexible. If you switch speakers, for example, if you have another pair of stereo speakers in the front, it will also switch the SonarWorks profile.
That's right.
So even if you don't mix in Atmos, this is really helpful. But now maybe we go one step back and talk about the product, because it is the very first immersive audio interface / monitor controller.
Yes.
I was asking myself, if somebody right now has 15 speakers, I mean, you still want to have one knob to control them all?
Yeah.
And there hasn't been any solution for this so far, right?
Well, not a dedicated solution.
Yeah.
So there have been ways to do it for several years now. Of course, Atmos is not a young format now, but it's been quite exclusive for a long time because you would have needed to be able to get 16 channels out to your device. Then if you want the calibration, that would have to feed to 16 channels of calibration hardware. Then that would feed to a monitor controller in a lot of cases with 16 channels. And
does that even exist? I don't know, maybe.
They exist. They're very expensive.
Yeah.
But they were all added together and would work as a system and would cost you a lot of money and would be 3 or 4, however many separate components. And so with Oria, we went, we want to do all of this in one.
Yeah.
So you can either, if you've got a big complicated system, just add this on with ADAT or Dante and just say, these are my outputs.
Like any traditional stereo or 5.1 monitor controller, right?
Yeah. But with all the calibration and everything just done. Or you plug in a USB cable and that's all you need. We thought about that from the perspective of let's say a huge post-production place, they've got this big complicated main room, and then they go, now that Atmos is in real high demand, we're going to have 10 more smaller rooms. That's going to cost us a fortune.
Yeah.
But if they go, oh, all we need is just one Oria in every room.
Yeah, that's nice. But it also has inputs, right? It has 16 inputs, I think. So you can use it as your main interface, still record 16 channels, I think, or even 18 channels.
Yeah, so it's got 2 of the console preamps inbuilt, and if you're using the ADAT inputs for mic preamps rather than as a monitor controller configuration, then yes, you can have 18 inputs. And just behind us, you'll be able to see we've just added in the latest software update the low latency mixer. So all the Q mixes for headphones and things don't have to go through the door and have the latency involved. So now it can be used very much in that way if you choose to have that as your primary recording interface as well.
That's a great concept. Monitor controller, USB interface, Sonar works inbuilt, no matter how many channels of it you need, converters, and it looks really nice, I gotta say that. And it feels good. I'm actually going to use it today for the first time. I'm probably going to do my first immersive mix today. I'm already very excited. But I have a lot more questions because, you know, I got to do a mix. So first of all, we don't have a mix bus. So we're just rendering this kind of cloud with all the additional data in there. But what if I want to EQ my mix bus? Is that still possible? Or limit
Yes.
or compress it or something?
It's very much possible. This is where we do need to start thinking about things in a slightly different way that traditionally with stereo recording, you tend to have like a master chain. You kind of have to get away from that at the moment with Atmos. But I have just seen this week, there was a company that have now made a plugin that goes across every channel that's got like a master limiter and a master EQ.
And they talk to each other somehow? And
yes.
Then, all right.
So that kind of thing is now on the horizon. That's not a limitation of Atmos, that's just developers haven't done that yet.
Okay.
But yeah, so...
But there is also something called a bed, which I understand as some kind of, let's call it a subgroup at least.
Yeah.
Where I can send all my tracks to, except for maybe some others. So I could send all my drum tracks into one bed and then process that, right?
Yes. So the way that you've got to think about the Atmos setup is it's a hybrid. So there is a bed which is more like the traditional...
Mix bus?
Yeah, it's got left, right, center, sub. It's 7.1.2 currently is the external Dolby limitation, but I think Cubase can do higher.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
But that then gets interpreted later, like we were saying with it still goes to the renderer.
Yeah.
But that then is something that can be used if you've got, let's say, plugins that only really work in the traditional way. Like a lot of these surround reverbs. I mean, we've been talking about Atmos a lot, but I like to use the word immersive more because it's more general.
Yeah.
And so immersive reverbs, as they exist right now, they have to output to channels.
Yeah.
Because a reverb isn't really a thing, it's more of a cloud of sound. So if you've got a surround reverb like the 7.1.4 reverb, that has to come out somewhere.
Okay.
So they've done that in such a way that you can have that going to the bed, which goes to the renderer, so it understands where they're supposed to go.
Yeah.
But beyond that, you have the objects, and the objects are really interesting because it's a thing, it's a sound, and it can go anywhere just in a 3D space.
Yeah.
And I think about that like if you're playing a game. Like if you're playing a shooter game or something like that, and there's a bad guy behind you and he shoots, in the game, he is an object and he is there. And he's not coming out of a speaker, he's there.
Yeah.
And then if you're on headphones or if you're on a surround sound setup, that then calculates where he is and puts that in the headphones so you hear this guy, and that's how game audio has worked for quite a long time.
Okay.
So I think they've just integrated that into a concept that now you just go, okay, this element is here, this element is there.
And one difference is that it can be moved, right? Or objects can be moved, so I can just make them go crazy.
If you want to, yeah.
If I want to, yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about going crazy, right? So what's the right way to mix a rock or a metal album in Atmos? I heard people say, I don't need that. For what? You know, I would want to stand right in front of a band, so stereo is enough because that's kind of the concert situation. You know, I want to have the drums right in front of me and the singer, and then maybe the guitars penned left and right and something. That's all I need. Where I went like, I'm often struggling with dense metal mixes where I have especially additional tracks, lead guitars, keyboards, any other, additional stuff. And this just gives me space to just pull things out of this crowded place there right in the front.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I've found that with stereo mixing, I know you found this as well, that when it's getting busy, you have to start EQing out so much just to try and get everything heard.
Yeah.
And when you move into immersive, suddenly you can go, okay, well, I've got 17 vocals fighting for space. Let's just move these just out a little and just out a little.
Yeah.
And suddenly you can hear them all. And maybe then you can just turn them down a little because they have the space and you don't have to fight them. But then if you turned them down in the stereo mix, they would be gone, they'd be lost.
Yeah.
And so you have much more freedom to be able to hear all of these really cool elements. And if with a shall we say simple orchestration like I don't know, AC/DC, where it's 2 guitars, 1 bass, drums, vocals, that there's a little bit you can do with Atmos, but not so much. But let's say we get into like symphonic metal or like some of the really dense progressive stuff, and there's all these elements going on, these like synths and choirs and all that. All
the shit you usually have to deal with. You're what's the word? You're fighting.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So with that, suddenly you've got this freedom to like have the band still at the front as kind of the main thing. And maybe you've got some like gothic Latin choir. Suddenly they come up from behind you going, ha, ha, and you're like, whoa.
Right.
And it's not taking away
I think
from
that's
the
interesting,
experience.
like having those moments, still having the impression of being in front of a band. I don't need the kick drum to be flying around or something. I want it to be where it is.
That's right.
Because there is a traditional like sonic image that we have of a band playing, and we want to keep that, maintain that. But then either you can put additional stuff somewhere else, or you can have that moment, whatever, in the chorus or just some part where something happens and you go like, just this. And I think I see like a lot of really cool opportunities without going too crazy in rock and metal. So I guess I just got to try it, right?
I think that's it. I mean,
I'm excited.
I showed Christian a mix that I did this morning. It was quite dense orchestration.
Yeah.
But the drums were recorded at Middle Farm. And I, from the beginning, had been trying to get kind of a big sound with the idea of doing this later. So I, as well as the full drum kit, I recorded a couple of mics that were pointed kind of high up and a couple of mics right at the back of the room. And so when it came to Atmos, I just put those in those positions quite quietly.
Yeah.
But they didn't interfere with the main drum mix, but you felt like you were stood in the room where the drummer played. Right.
It's still in front of you in a way. So like all the closed mics and everything, but you have a 3D feeling without being overwhelmed by, too much.
That's right. Yeah. So the overall drum mix was still a very modern mix, still very present, still very punchy, but it didn't take away from it by having just a bit of a feeling of being in that room. That's another thing that's interesting about the way you can work with Atmos is you can have a center channel that's almost separate from the left-right mix.
Okay.
And so I just added a little bit into the center of the bass so that grind could stand out without being too loud.
What's the difference between having something on the left and right speakers, which is pseudo-center, so to say, and a real center speaker?
The difference is positional. The way that the human ears work, we can locate things that are separate sources much better. Like, one of the things that we always fight with stereo is the speakers are trying to replicate every element at the same time. And by just physically removing that from that speaker and just allowing a different speaker to present it, suddenly the ear can go that.
Right.
And then you find that you can turn it down a little because it was fighting before and blending with the other elements. I find, especially with distorted guitars and distorted bass, they were really blending into one machine before, which can be a really cool effect.
Yeah.
But if you're struggling to separate the two, then...
So you put the bass on the center and then the guitars left and right? Or how do you...
So it's all, for me, the way with the metal mix, it all starts as left and right. But then I use objects, so I put the objects left and right. And the way that you can play around, there's a thing called size, where traditionally, you put something somewhere and it's a tiny little point of sound.
Yes.
And that's the way that surround sound has always worked. Is you kind of take an object and you put it there. But with the size, traditionally that was called divergence with old surround sound.
So that's just in the surround panner that you have in Cubase or in your DAW, you have another parameter called size.
Yes, or divergence, and that starts to bleed that element out into other speakers.
So you still put it into that position, and then you open it up, which means it will split it to other speakers while maintaining that position.
That's right.
Interesting. Okay.
And I found that, like, for heavy rhythm guitars, I didn't do that because I wanted that kind of typical wall of sound. But with the bass, it just kind of there was an extra little warmth and some kind of definitely the distortion grind.
Okay, so you put the bass into the middle, and then you widen the size, and it just it goes somewhere else. And interesting. Yeah.
And so it can really depend what you're doing. Some of the record labels recommend not overusing the center channel, especially for things like vocals, because if you're going to be using your music in film, which is a lot of the time what ends up happening, the center channel is where the dialogue goes, the film dialogue. So the general recommendation is try and avoid that. So you tend to use the left and right for main vocals like you always used to. Okay. But maybe there's a special effect that comes out the middle.
Okay, so you could even just skip that speaker if you wanted to, right?
Yeah.
Just have,
if you're using the bed method or having the objects kind of spread out to where the left and right channels would be, then that naturally happens without you having to overthink it.
How does the subwoofer work? Is that something that is fixed to a certain frequency? Is that something that I control from Oria, from the audio interface? Or is that, are all the frequencies below whatever going there? Can I decide which frequency goes there?
Okay, so there are two answers that are both correct. So with Atmos specifically, nothing goes to the low frequency channel unless you specifically send it there.
Okay.
Usually the expectation for music is that you don't use the LFE apart from like special effects like sub drop or that kind of thing. Okay. Because they expect the front speakers or whichever speakers to be able to go down to like 20 hertz.
To be wide range enough, yeah, okay.
Because it was originally designed for like cinema.
Okay, so that's very different from your studio subwoofer setup where anything below whatever frequency goes there, okay.
But the other answer is that we have a thing called bass management, because we know that most speakers don't go down that far. Yeah. So you'll see it in a lot of systems, like if you've got a 2.1 system with stereo and a sub, where there'll be a crossover where the top speakers no longer handle the bass, and that gets sent to the subwoofer. It's the same type of thing. Yeah. And you can set the crossover frequency on Oria so that wherever that point is, beyond that point it slopes off, so the sub takes over and the rest of the speakers then don't have to deal with that.
Deal with that, okay, okay. But that is just the monitoring, right, in Oria? Yes, but like the mixing, so I have a dedicated button where I can say I also want the kick drum to go to the sub channel. Or how do I, or I blend it, or how do I do that?
So the way you would do that, depends on the DAW partly. If it's an object, some of the object planners have an LFE send, some don't. Okay. But if it's going to the bed, you would send to channel 4 on the bed, because that's left, right, center, sub, or LFE. Okay. LFE is different from sub technically. So you would just send some to the LFE channel.
I see, I gotta rethink or overthink quite a few things before getting started.
It's the kind of thing where once you've done it once, I think it becomes very natural.
My plan right now for my first immersive mix is to create a bed, which for me, feels like my master bus. I just throw all tracks to that bed and start mixing, just put them wherever I want them, you know, have maybe some of the drum rooms in the back, maybe I have 4 rhythm guitar tracks, maybe have 2 of them in the front, the other ones maybe slightly behind me, I don't know yet. And then maybe just have a few extra tracks where I want to have some movements and turn them into objects. So I can like let them fly around, like special effects or like a sub drop or stuff like that, you know, to make it a little more entertaining. Is that a good plan, or?
Yeah, there are different schools of thought with Atmos that are all valid. The way that you're thinking is, I would describe that as bed-based mixing, which I've seen a lot of guys have a great effect with that, and that's really effective for them. I tend to work on the other side, which is object-based, where I don't use the bed very much at all, and I make everything an object.
Because you can have 127 or something? Or
128,
128 objects, so as long as you don't have more than 128 tracks, you can turn everything into an object?
Absolutely, yeah. Okay. So that's how I like to work, and that way the bed is reserved for things like the reverbs and the sub, things that have to be that way.
Can I use Oria as well for switching from my 15 speaker setup just to stereo?
Yes,
to see how that translates. That's what I mean, because
Yes, you absolutely can.
people are going to listen to the Atmos mix in stereo.
That's right. So yes, you can, and there are multiple ways. So to start with, there are 2 separate sets of stereo outputs on Oria that you can switch between.
Okay, like totally different speakers.
Completely different, yeah. So like the way that I work in my room, I've got 714 with Cali audio, and then I switch to the classic kind of 80s speakers. That's the kind of thing I work on. But in here we're all on PMCs, but we've also got the PMC mains behind us, which also, if you just want to work in stereo that day, and you like these mains, you can, and you don't have to change your setup.
That's great.
That used to be a big problem that we heard from people who wanted to change.
Yeah.
That was difficult, and we tried to make that very easy.
Sure.
And as it changes, if you've got different calibration for the mains, that all changes same time.
That's awesome. Yeah. And you can have a subwoofer in the traditional way then, right?
Yes. Currently, you would hook those up as a 2.1 system just out of 2 channels, but we are planning on having that very soon, as you can just have the sub with your mains.
Okay. And I do also have all the other typical monitor controller features, right? I can solo speakers, I can switch to mono, I can mute speakers, I can do all that kind of stuff, right?
Flip the phase on one side to check it. That's all on there. That's absolutely right.
And you've got an iPad app for that, is that correct?
Yeah, it's another thing that's coming out very soon. But yes, if you've not got 3 different screens to work off with the software app, then you can have the iPad app just to your side.
As a remote control.
That's right.
Because otherwise it's just a 19-inch unit, right?
That's right.
So you can use the hardware knob there, or you control it from the
software, yeah.
And very soon, actually today, I'm going to be using it for the very first time. So I'm about to do my first immersive mix, which is going to be a black metal song. Just go heavy. And I'll be back with another video. This was a lot of talking, but I will be back with another video where I show you, how I mixed that song. And that's a song that's actually going to be released. So, so that's going to be some serious work, and I shouldn't screw it up. But thank you so much for all the information. Now it's time to do some real work. I see you in the next Atmos video. See you in hell, motherfuckers. Bye-bye.